Hi, welcome to Kintsugi Conversations. And our very, very first podcast on our very first guest, who I'll introduce in a second. But let me introduce myself. So I'm Rob Balfour.
And I'm Niamh Rose.
And it's welcome Sophie Olson, who is the founder and driving force behind the Flying Chiild project, and an amazing book that's just been published with the same title. So hello, Sophie. And we've been sending clues across Twitter that we're ready to fly and all sorts of things. And I think
did I ruin it? Sorry,
thought it was Star Trek because I'm a Star Trek fan, but actually it was because we were giving them a clue, so I don't think they guessed. So would you like to introduce yourself briefly and say hello to the audience?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Rob. And thank you, Niamh, as well, for inviting me on. And I'm really sorry, I must have just ruined all of that because I put a post out on Twitter saying I was coming on. So sorry about that. I didn't realise that you were doing that. And I didn't realise that I was your first guest. I feel very honoured. So I am Sophie. I am a survivor activist and I'm the founder of the Flying Chiild. So we are a community interest company leading conversations about child sexual abuse. And we do this through survivor-led training, campaigning, and support of adult survivors across the world. I'm also a writer, and I'm a mum, and I think that's everything. I think that's me.
I think that's a lot, Sophie. So that's a lot. So these conversations are really new. So we thought about them because it came out of a series of group discussions we had last November. We were situated around films that we showed as a kind of fringe film festival project. And what really emerged was the story, not so much very important stories about the experience of child sexual abuse and the kind of experiences of fighting that. But it's the activism that was missing. So what we really want to use these podcasts for is to talk about activism, about the change process that individuals, both directly who are survivors and allies of survivors, are trying to drive in society, in a society that is, still very resistant to it, in my experience. So I'll let Niamh kind of pick up from there.
So I'm actually going to start with a quote from your book, Sophie, because I think it really aligns with the podcast. And the quote is, "The Flying Chiild project brings lived experience into the heart of a professional setting, and it was sparked by a conversation." And this is Kintsugi Conversations. So we've kind of, in the introduction episode that we did, we spoke about how we feel conversation is kind of at the heart of change. And I just didn't know if you wanted to share more about that conversation that sparked the Flying Chiild, like where that came from.
Yes, and I use it a lot now. I use this as an anecdote now in my own training, in keynotes that I do, because I think it illustrates beautifully the power of conversation. It's so simple, isn't it?
Yeah.
I always say that, influencing change is not rocket science. It's within all of us to be able to make a difference, despite the restrictions that, or even perceived restrictions that we have. There's always something that we can do. And this conversation, it was back in 2019, and I had been invited to take part in the safeguarding training myself. So I went along, not really thinking much of it, and was really struck by how, well, it was a couple of things struck me actually. First of all, how little was said about child sexual abuse. And secondly, what was said, I was absolutely fine with. And so I was really reflecting on how well I was doing in my life, because maybe a few years before that, even that little mention might have set me back a little bit and set me spiraling, because I hadn't received the right support to be able to process my own trauma. And afterwards, the head said, if anybody would like to speak to me privately afterwards, please do. I recognise that this can bring up things for people. And I just thought, well, I'm going to do it. I'm just going to say to her, I was one of those children. That was how I started the conversation. I just said I was one of those children. And it's at this point, isn't it, that when you disclose, that conversations tend to shut down. In my experience, they can shut down very fast. And that is often because people just don't know what to say in response. It can make people feel understandably really uncomfortable. People might worry that they're going to make it worse. But it didn't happen with this head teacher. She demonstrated what we would now coin as this wonderful professional curiosity. And she asked me questions about what it was like being that child at school. So she said, did you show any signs? Did you show any signs, do you think, that you were being sexually abused? And nobody had ever asked me that before. I'd never thought about that before. So, really thinking on my feet, I said, well, I think I was quite quiet. I was quite good. I didn't want to get noticed. I didn't want to get into trouble. Just kind of put my head down and got on with things, really. And then she said, did you disclose? And I said, no. And then she said, why not? But it wasn't said in a judgmental, why not? It was a curious, why not? And she followed it with, what barriers do you think stood in the way? What did you need from staff? And what would have made a difference? And we chatted for a while, maybe it was quite a long time. It was about 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And I came away from that conversation feeling for the very first time that my voice had a place, that my experience was valuable to somebody, and that she'd learnt something in a way that she might not learn if she'd picked up a book or if she'd listened to a case study. And then I started thinking, well, what about all the other people? Because I can only speak for me. My signs are my signs, and the barriers were my barriers, and what about everybody else? What about all the other people? And I started thinking about all the other people in the room, and I wondered how many of those were survivors at that safeguarding meeting that we'd just been in. And it started something going in my head, and then I went back to her a few days later and I said, I'm not quite sure what this would look like yet, but if I could develop some kind of project to support the safeguarding training that you currently run, could I pilot it in your school? And she said, yes, please. And so that's what happened. And today we work across many different sectors. So education is perhaps what we've become most known for, but we're also working in social work, therapeutic and support settings, and in the NHS as well. And it's all because of a conversation. But what happened was that I found a way of bringing in other people's voices. It's not just mine, and it's a constantly evolving project, which is really important because I never want it to become stuck, because things always change. And so, and everybody's got a voice. And so we can only ever do our best. We can only ever bring in what we can bring in. And we make it really clear that it's actually really small part of this bigger picture. We're never going to claim that we're the experts, but equally neither can they, because none of us are experts. We're always learning, and so we will say, this is a small group of around 30 survivors from across the world. Most of these people had not disclosed at all, so they're not taking part in research studies. What they say, again, they speak for themselves, but they don't speak for all. We must constantly listen and learn. And it's not every day that you get to hear from pretty silent survivors. And the feedback was amazing. I don't think we knew what to expect on that first one. It was one of the most nerve-wracking things I think I've ever done in my life, standing in front of about 90 odd people. A lot of them I knew as well. And I began to see firsthand the power of speaking out, partly because we got a lot of disclosures as well afterwards. And I mean, that's a whole other side to this now, that we're managing in a very different way to we did that very first time. We're learning ourselves as we go along. But yes, the feedback's good, and all because of conversation. It was so simple. Look at the door that it opened.
Yeah, that's just like such a wonderful story, I think, especially because it kind of came from, as well, like one individual in a professional setting that was actually open to hearing your experience, and made you feel comfortable to be able to share that experience too. And I think as well, the kind of involvement of multiple survivors and their stories, and recognizing that not everyone's has the same experiences or feels the same way, is really important too, because I think, especially from the perspective of someone like me, I'm an ally, I'm not a survivor, and I think when you're in those spaces, you can often like almost like blanket survivors and be like, yeah, they've all had the same experiences and they feel the same way.
Yes.
But actually it's not like that at all, and it's so naive to think that it would be like that too. Have you got anything to add, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things listening to you, Sophie. That one of the things you brought back a memory, to be honest with you, that's over 20 years old now. Although when I was in a conference in Minneapolis in 2003, and there was a guy there who was a gang member from Boston, I think, and he was in his 40s, and he kind of left the gang thing, but he was one of these street gangs, so his entire upper body was tattooed with gang imagery, and he was a survivor, and he was talking about being in school and being abused by his uncle within his family. And when he went to school, he was quite disruptive and all sorts of things. And he was angry about the fact, and I've got him on a piece of film, because they made a film at the time called Stories of Silence, which I've got the rights to show in the UK, so I might show it actually. It hasn't been shown for a long time now. I'll speak to the director who may not want to show anymore. But in it, he's seen talking about it. And what he says is, if only someone had asked me, because at the time he became so confused about things that he ended up being a gang member. But he talked, well, I wanted, I was so crazy, he said, I would go to peace rallies against this war or whatever, carrying a gun in my pocket. And I was a narcissist, so he'd burn down places. And he said, if someone had asked me in the school at the time when I was a kid, has someone done something to you that made you so angry? I might well have told them. So that brings that, I bring that that memory back, and it's the clips in my head as I think about it. And also this idea that survivors, are homogenous, are one thing, and they're like everybody else on the planet. Every group of human beings on the planet, you might have a core experience that's the same in relation to the violation of your bodily agency and psychological, spiritual agency by an abuser using sex as the tool to which to deploy that. But everybody's individual, everyone's different. But I think there's a natural tendency in all activism, whether it's fighting to save the whales in the Antarctic, or it's, saving, this building somewhere, that activism comes with passion, and it all comes with a sense of safety as well. So people want you to be the same. So it's called, psychologists would call it kind of in groups and out groups. So it's kind of, if you're not in the in group, if you're kind of out of it, then you're kind of tension. Whereas if you're in it, everyone feels safe. And that gets, in my experience, even more focused in sexual violence because of the issues around trust, obviously, that come with being somebody who's kind of experienced that violation.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's easier for people to other survivors as one group, isn't it? Because I think part of the reason that people do that is because it keeps us firmly at arm's length from them. I think there are so many people, again, understandably, I can understand it, that don't want to be tainted by the subject. And it's easier just to go, well, people are just this one big group, and they do this and they look like this. and they come from families like these, and this is what happens, and I know everything there is to know about it, and it's not going to affect me. I'm going to keep myself in my little bubble. And I think it's understandable, but it needs to be challenged, because until people recognise that actually this impacts all of us as a society, the statistics being as high as they are means that it can't fail to impact absolutely everybody on this planet in some way, either directly or indirectly. We will all know a survivor of CSA. We just might not know that we know them.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to open conversations about it, because we need to well, for lots of reasons, partly because this silence is so damaging, of course, for the survivor. It's so damaging to live a life where you feel that you just cannot, for whatever reason, speak out. What do you do when you don't have the words to say, well, I know what I did and I internalized that distress to the extent where I'm lucky to be alive today. But also breaking that stigma and shifting public attitudes so that people understand that this is a subject that is actually okay to talk about, that this is something that, yes, it does impact on me too. That is the vital form of prevention in my mind, because of course, who relies on the silence? It's the ones that abuse children, and they absolutely rely on this silence. And we are so conditioned into it from childhood as survivors. Some of us might be told to stay silent, but others aren't. Again, that's another perhaps a misconception that all survivors are told to stay silent. Well, I wasn't told to stay silent, but I was shown in different ways through his behaviour, and I learned to be silent. Those messages were then reinforced by society. So through my education, I was bombarded with stranger danger messaging, which didn't apply to me, because my situation, the abuse that I suffered was within the four walls of my family home, and so it quite literally did not apply to me. I remember the lessons, and I remember studying the poster on the wall, and it didn't apply to me. So it missed me. And I think that hasn't changed as much as we would have hoped over the years. So we're looking now back at I was at school in the 1980s. And as a parent today, I see those messages are being perpetuated, but in a slightly different guise. We get emails from the school saying, safeguarding emails saying the biggest risks to your children are through county lines, through image sharing, smartphones, technology, online grooming, technology assisted abuse, and so on. Now, I'm not minimising those messages that are coming home, because these are huge risks to our children, and we need to be aware of them. We need to be educated, and so do our children. But there's always this gap, this hole, where what we never hear is your children are also at risk from those within their own networks, from perhaps people even within their own families. That is still not being said in the way that it needs to be. And then we expect children to speak out. But as adults, we're not speaking out. We're not having these conversations because it makes us feel so deeply uncomfortable on a visceral level. And I understand that too. I'm a parent, and I don't like to have these conversations with my children either. But I do, because I'm not going to be perpetuating those messages within my own family unit. Don't know if I answered your question, Rob. I feel like I went right off on a tangent there.
I think you answered it really well, and it's brought up. My reflection would be that, when I was asked when I disclosed, why didn't you say anything? Well, I was 6 when I first started. The first kind of assault was 6, and why didn't you say anything? And the only answer I had was, I kind of knew not to. No one had told me not to say anything. There was no kind of course where you were told never say anything anybody sexually assaults you, but I just knew not to say anything.
Yeah.
So I didn't. And that secret, was perpetuated in other situations because my story is quite well known. But I didn't tell anybody until I was nearly 40.
Mm.
And, the power of the silence is underestimated by people, really. I mean, fortunately, I think it's breaking in the sense that we use that term. I think it's breaking because we've been challenging it for, the challenges are overwhelming the system, really. The system is what we used to, we used to call institutions and professionals. But they're still hiding from it, Sophie. And I think that the terror is like mandatory reporting, and you can argue the merits of mandatory reporting and for lots of different angles. But the principle of it is sound, is that, children should be protected at the first point of disclosure by anybody. That's what should happen. The system feels, well, actually, it's more nuanced than that, and we have to be careful about it. And there are some agencies that believe that, if you had mandatory reporting that was truly open, then they may have to report things that people are telling them, especially young people within services. And, county lines might be an example of that. If you're working with somebody in county lines and you're building up a relationship with a child, often who's been in looked after care, and you're trying to develop a relationship with male or female, and they're being exploited sexually and criminally by those gangs, and you've got a point of trust with them, but they can't leave the gang because there's massive implications for themselves or, say, siblings that might be caught up in it as well, and family members. And, you ringing up the police when they disclose to you instantly might create more issues for them in many ways. So it may make the society feel more morally justified in that action, but there might be implications for that child and their family members from very ruthless people. And I'll tell you a quick anecdotal story that I heard many years ago. And somebody was saying, well, we should automatically, if someone is sending drug smugglers from China, Hong Kong this was, to the United Kingdom, when they were bringing in, or they were being brought in to be exploited, that if we discovered them at Heathrow Airport, we should put them straight on back of the plane and send them back to the triads in Hong Kong. So they got the message that they could not be, we were not going to allow that to happen. And someone pointed out to the person who was stressing that it isn't as simple as that, because you might send them back to the triad in Hong Kong, but the triad might decide then to send you a message, and that message would be they behead them and send you the video. And then you have to make a choice as a person sending them back that the triad will send somebody else. So, we have to be very careful about it. But I think the principle is that we should break these triads and break these processes by being more open society and allowing. I think I'm going off on a tangent now, but
No,
it's
I'm following.
but it's some things aren't simple, and I think that's what terrifies systems. In my experience, is they want it to be simple. That's why they have categorizations and labels, and they want neat solutions to very complex processes, and they want to feel safe about who's doing it. So they don't want people who might be challenging to the status quo, i.e. within mental health services, saying illness doesn't exist, there's no evidence for it, where other people are very kind of comforted by the fact they may get a mental health diagnosis, whereas others would find that completely abhorrent and an affront to their human rights to be labelled as ill. So you have all these conflicts, and when you bring trauma into it as well, what you get is kind of, well, I'm not ill, I'm abused. And, then you get a kind of different conversation. And the system finds that very difficult, especially in the NHS. Trauma is kind of been known for a long, long time. I would argue, quite honestly, that we've kind of been in a conflict of change since Freud, and that really the real resistance comes from society itself, which is why I don't use break the silence, because I think it places the individual at the centre of the change. And actually, I'd call it prefer challenging the silence. That's a more political stance to take in the sense of social action, because it says society needs to break its own silence on these issues. It shouldn't be down to survivors to do that.
I agree. I agree with you, actually, and I think that was very much behind the tagline that we came up with It's about 18 months ago. Our tagline is "Society's shame, not mine," and the reason behind that is because it's for me it's deeper than what happens between the perpetrator and the victim. Of course it's the abuser's shame. Of course it is. However, in my experience, it's then what happens next. It's the lack of support. It's the lack of understanding. It's the judgment. It's the lack of justice. It's the pathologizing of trauma responses. It's the turning away. It's the shuttered expressions when I say to people what I do for a job. It's the mothers that don't speak to me at the school gate again because they're not quite sure how to have conversations with me because they know I'm a survivor. That's the shame of society, and that needs to be really challenged, and it needs to shift, and it needs to become unacceptable to respond to survivors in the way that people currently respond. And I think we can do that in many different ways. I think that's the great thing about activism, is that it can suit everybody, can't it? Because there's space for all of it. There's space for real kind of a shouty, raging activism, and there's space for quieter, persuasive activism, and there's space for activism through writing and through art and through theatre and through music. And I think it's so fantastic that you can do it in your way. You can be centre stage, or you can be like I am tonight, just a pair of hands. And that's another thing that I like to show people, that I can't be visible. I'm still at risk from the perpetrator. This still continues. It still goes on, and yet I can still do the work that I want to do, and I can still live a good life, and I can live a happy life. And I never ever thought that would be possible. I didn't think that life was for me. I thought that I felt like I was an onlooker to my own life, that I was going through the motions, and I was deeply unhappy. And me and tangents, Niamh and Rob. I am terrible. I literally cannot keep track of my thoughts at all. They go all over the place.
I think Niamh would testify in court that your tangents are far less inclined than my tangents. Because mine can be multiple of 10,000 at the same time. But going on the theme that you was talking about, society itself, there's a book that landed in my in tray over the weekend, because I'm a member of the British Psychological Society, and their current edition is it's political psychology, which is talking about the kind of relationship between society, what we call society, the individual, and the culture, basically. And I did that for my BSc in relation to sexual violence for my dissertation. And there's a book that's been published, Social Psychology of Trauma, Connecting the Personal and the Political. And I'll send you the book, Sophie, so you can have a read of it. And I think you will really find it absolutely reinforcing everything you just said. And it's only just been published, and I'll send it to you as a PDF so you can share it widely. Because it really talks about the challenging of these processes that are rooted in society, that are imprisoning people, as we know. Anyway, I could talk about political trauma and all the rest of it forever, and kind of doing this stuff. So I lots of questions to ask from that. So I don't know what Niamh would like to go on to ask, but I'm really interested in hearing more about the activism and the power of it, because survivors, not everybody is a survivor has to choose activism. As you say, you can be on Twitter and be an activist, in my view. So that's enough if that's what you want to do. But for some people, it's about really visibly being out there and changing it. So clearly it was for me. And I don't deny that as being a very fundamental part of whatever we want to define as recovery, really, for any individual. I mean, it's really about kind of changing the world, finding meaning for me. And if you look behind me, there's a picture of a kind of very angry young boy. I didn't draw that. I found there a guy who was living in France. And when I saw it, it kind of spoke to me of the rage that exists within the silence that is enforced on survivors. And, and then there's the guitar, and there's even a Klingon teddy bear there. That's someone who once bought me. That survivors can feel as if they're kind of Klingon, And the world can see them one way through their stereotypes, but actually they're children in many ways inside, the inner child, all of that kind of thing. Yet they want to change the world. It's amazing how many survivors want to do good rather than to do bad.
Yes, it really is. Sorry, Niamh, were you going to ask me a question? I don't want to step in because I think you were going to ask me something there.
I was mainly just going to kind of reconsolidate what you guys were saying. I think it's so important as adults and allies that we are setting an example, and even though you might feel uncomfortable, it's like you have to be comfortable in the uncomfortableness, because the experiences of these, like any survivor, it's that uncomfortableness is worth it. If that wasn't very articulate, but but yeah, and I think as well it's definitely uncomfortable in the professional spaces, and I think in your book as well you mentioned how you were in multiple settings where people were asking you if you'd been abused, but you knew that you couldn't say yes, and once you'd said no, like you could see that was the right answer, and then it was like that silence was just reconsolidated.
Yes.
And that's why it's so important to ignore the uncomfortableness, because it's not about you at that point. It's about the survivor and supporting them and letting them have that space. And that's definitely something I keep at the forefront of my allyship, I guess. But yeah, I just think that systems and professional settings just aren't doing enough to make survivors feel comfortable. So yeah, and I just think that was a really good point.
Yeah, I think the being asked by different people, it's quite useful. It's quite a useful anecdote to bring into my training, because yes, I was asked. I was asked on separate occasions if I was being sexually abused, but it was the way that they asked me that was so awkward and uncomfortable, and it immediately shut me down. Immediately made me very awkward and uncomfortable, and saying what I knew they wanted me to say. I knew they wanted me to say no. So I was around 10 at this point. I remember it very clearly, and I could see immediately that no was the right answer. Straight away, it was the right answer, because I could see the relief. And what is really sad about that is that they didn't ask me anymore. That they didn't ask me again, despite being so concerned that they asked me these separately. There must have been a conversation between them all as adults, and yet they didn't ask me again. And I think that was a bit of a pattern, really, because I had the same thing with the teacher, although I didn't realise that until much later when I was doing my own research for the project. And that was being able to track down on Facebook my old teacher. He had taught me between the ages of, I think, 9 and 10, and he'd been the teacher of it was a very small class, which, I mean, this is the 1980s for you, but it was called Remove. Because I mean, I laugh, but I mean, it's horrendous, really, when you think about it. But it was a class for children with learning and additional needs, and I'd been put into this class, or removed out of the bigger class and put into this small class of about 10 children, because I was so anxious at school, because I was beginning to really struggle, and I was frightened of the male teacher, and I was taken into this class again. So it's a bit of a pattern, really, in my life. I was obviously the problem. They had to move me out, put me into this class. But actually, I was very happy in this class, and he was a lovely teacher. I really liked him, this guy. And when I found him on Facebook, I sent him this message just saying, is there anything that you can recall about me or my family? Did anything give you cause for concern? Were there any indicators that you can think of? Initially, he said no, and I thought that was the end of it. He then came back to me, and he said, actually, I do, because I sent him a picture of myself at that age as well. And he said, I do remember that I thought you were troubled, nervous, and had a cowering demeanour. And it was my response was, I mean, on one hand, it was extremely validating, because that was the first time that actually somebody said, yeah, we saw it, we really saw it. On the other hand, it was a real blow, because he was saying he saw it, and he was also then saying, and he did nothing. And the reason he did nothing, he got quite defensive at this point. He said, I did nothing because I feared, and I quote him here, he said, I feared how I would be perceived if I asked you probing questions. So he didn't ask any questions at all. And it's a very, very useful thing to bring into the training, partly because we can think, oh yeah, but that was the 1980s was a very special time with regards to safeguarding and practice in primary schools. But he's only just retired, this man, last year. So yeah, and he's still a school governor. And I think, well, has it changed that much? Or is it that his personal attitude for well, in his case, fear of how he may be perceived? I mean, thank goodness for his honesty, because this is something that we need to have conversations about. Why did he fear that? Was that something that a female teacher would fear, or was this something that he felt because he was male and I was female? I don't know. Well, we need to have these conversations, though, don't we? But yes, it was. I just think how many times over this man's career did his instinct, it comes down to an instinct, doesn't it, sometimes as well? Troubled, nervous, cowering. It's kind of a bit of an instinct too. There's nothing really physical that you can see. There aren't bruises that you can see visibly. What do you do with that? And how do you manage that situation? And there seems to be so much fear that we sense, that we're told about, that teaching and non-teaching staff are fearful. They're fearful of getting it wrong. They're fearful of making a mistake. They're fearful of opening a can of worms. They're fearful of holding these conversations. Perhaps they're survivors themselves, and they're fearful of having the conversations because of what it means for them, and they might not have processed any trauma themselves. You know, how difficult is that? And yet they're expected then to be on the front line and to be able to do this perfect job. And so are social workers, and so is everybody else, and anybody in a professional role. And we need to start looking beyond that professional role and looking at it from human to human, because, you know, we're all humans. We're all humans. And one of the things that I will say, last week I was working with counselling students. Human first. That's what you need to be, is human first. Practitioner second. When you become so tied up in protocol and policy, you forget that you're just looking at a little human being, or you're looking at an adult survivor who is a human being, who was a child once, and you were a child once, and actually we all know what it feels like to be a child, and you can relate to this, because everybody can relate to it. Everybody has experienced at some point in their life a lack of empathy, or they've been on the receiving end of bullying, or somebody's been really unkind to them, or they felt that they haven't had a voice. We can all relate to that to some extent. You know, this isn't, we're not so different. Survivors aren't so different to everybody else. I don't know if that answered your question. I've forgotten what you said now.
Yeah, no, I definitely do think the onus is always on the survivor or the person trying to speak up, but they're not given the resources to speak up, or given the space or the acceptance. But then I guess that's where something like the Flying Chiild project is tackling that. And then hopefully with all of the schools and organisations you work with, that will slowly start to change.
I hope it does. I mean, I always say to people at the end that it's my call to action, but, you know, it is as important to me that they go home and they start talking about what they've just heard today. You know, I say to them, please go and share it on your own personal social media. Go and talk about your training. Talk about the stories that you heard. Talk about it. Talk about it with your family. Talk about it with your children. Talk about it with your colleagues, with your neighbours, with your, you know, with your partners. it's so important to start talking about it, and it's so simple. When we start talking, we're really helping to challenge that silence. Anybody can have a conversation, but it's amazing how few people do. And when they do, it's absolutely fantastic. You see something, you see somebody, you can see you've really made them feel so passionately about it, and you get some people saying, I really want to support what you're doing. What can I do? What can I do? And there's so much that people can do, and I always feel it's so important to leave people with hope that they're on an individual level. There is so much that somebody can do. And the worst thing they can do is shut it down and never talk about it again, and leave it in those 2 hours of that safeguarding training. And the feedback that I'm getting suggests that it is filtering through, and people are thinking, people are being challenged, and people are angry as well. I had one lady, and she had a tear on her face. So I stopped the workshop and I checked in with her, and she said, I'm not triggered. I'm not a survivor. I'm so angry. She said, how is it that I'm getting to the end of my career in teaching, and this is the first time I've heard this subject spoken about so openly. There is so much that I didn't know. And, that was difficult for me because, it's frustrating. And I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. But the fact is, it is not in training in the way that you would expect. It's not in any training anywhere in the way that you would expect. And that is why survivors then have a really, really tough time later on as well. Because these patterns that were happening then in childhood, with people looking the other way, people wanting me to say, no, I'm fine. That then happened when I did reach out for help, and I reached out to the GP, which is what a lot of people do. And I said, I need help. And her decision delayed, I use the word healing, it compounded trauma for the next 10 years of my life. I lost a decade of my life to the mental health system. Now, she didn't intend to cause me harm. She didn't know what else to do with me. And in fact, what I needed from her was actually just a simple conversation. I didn't need her to go in all guns blazing and refer me to a psychiatrist who referred me to an addiction specialist. I didn't need that. I needed just for her to say, what can I do? What do you need? I'm sorry that this happened to you. I'm sorry that he did this to you. What can we do? This is what's available to you. But she didn't. She set me on this path, which was a medicalised route. But at the time, of course, I say, of course, maybe I was just a bit stupid, but I didn't realise it was a medicalised route. It was just the route. I was just referred, and I went along, and I don't know what I was thinking. You're told by the mental health system, aren't you? Reach out. It's okay to not be okay. You're not alone. And actually, I ended up being far worse, very much alone, and it didn't help me at all to reach out. And I regretted it I do regret it now hugely. I regret that moment of hesitating at her door and saying, actually, there's something else I need to tell you. And once I was in the place where you would think people have a greater understanding, they didn't. Things got worse and worse and worse for me, because every single behaviour relating to trauma was identified as a disorder. If there was something wrong with me, there was a chemical imbalance in my brain. And at first, I embraced it, because when you're told you're ill, you're told there's a cure. Then who's not going to embrace that? But it became so quickly part of my identity as well, that I absolutely believed that I was sick, I was ill, I was disordered. There was something so inherently wrong with me. And you can see that in the book, because when I get to the point where I am finally going to peer support, I describe the other women in the group as broken. They're broken princesses. And this was a word that I used because it was how I viewed myself, as broken. but I'd been told I was broken. You know, there was something wrong with me. So by the time Pat met me, she was not only having to support me with trauma, but she was also having to support me with the trauma of being in the mental health system for 10 years, of inpatient stays, of forced sedation, of a multitude of diagnoses and ever-changing medication, and ultimately being told you have a severe and enduring mental illness. Unfortunately, you will never live without community support and medication. There will be no recovery. And those are the exact words that my psychiatrist said to me. I was around 30 years old, and I believed that my life was over. But there was a tiny, tiny spark inside me that, can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah.
It was a great big fuck you.
Mm.
Why can't you fucking see it? And then I did disclose to him. And then he said, well, I'm sorry to hear that, but we need to focus on what's wrong with you. And he was always shifting it back to this mental illness. His only response to this disclosure was to say, well, you must tell your family. And so he invited my family in, and we sat in the psychiatrist's office, which is absolutely tiny little room. It was me, my mother, my stepfather, my psychiatrist, and a lovely mental health nurse who held my hand, and I had to tell them. And he literally said, Sophie has something that she needs to say. I mean, it was everything that you should not do when helping support somebody with trauma. I mean, it was one of the worst situations you could imagine being put into. And it caused immense harm, both to me and to my family, who were not offered support. I was not offered support. And even in that system, when I was able to say to a therapist in there that I wanted to talk to you about my childhood, I said to her, and I found this in a diary entry recently when I was planning my workshop for Drop the Disorder. And I'd written that this had happened in my diary, and I'd totally forgotten about it. And I'd said to her, I want to tell you about my childhood, because in rehab, they're always saying, there is a root cause to your addiction, and, you know, we need to uncover the root causes. So on the surface, it looks like they're doing the right thing, but they don't want to hear it, because then when I said to her, I want to tell you, she said, well, there is no point in looking back. You're an adult now, not a child, and you need to take responsibility for your actions. So the focus was very much on our actions. It was a very punitive program. You know, there was absolutely no trust between therapist and patient, and, you know, we were breathalyzed every time we came in on site, and urine tested, and, you know, all the things that go on, and there was no care, there was no heart, there was no empathy. And the best bit of being in that place was the smoking hut, where I would go out and I would go and smoke with other survivors, and we would talk. I remember talking to this amazing man, and he told me a little bit about his experience, and I told him a little bit about mine, and we had our 10-minute cigarette and coffee, and then we went back in, and we put our metaphorical masks back on our faces, and we sat in group therapy, and we made up something about the root causes of our addictions. It wasn't a safe enough environment in there for me to be able to speak, and I think that is extremely sad, because I would imagine that not much has changed as well. I mean, I may be wrong, maybe it has, but from when I tell these stories, the responses that I'm getting back through social media, particularly through Twitter, suggest that actually not much has changed at all, and that responses to disclosure from both family and or practitioners is actually pretty dire, and it causes a lot of harm and a lot of shame, and it shouldn't be that way, and it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, and it's so disappointing as well that the GP is like the first place that you would go, or all these places that you were places that you expected to kind of feel safe and for them to help. And for a lot of people, if they are struggling, they're going to go to the GP, and then they're not getting the support that they need, and it it's just so disappointing.
Yeah. And GPs frustrated though as well.
Yeah.
I'm in contact with a few amazing GPs who really want to change the system, and they are so frustrated because not only are you're perhaps working with people, again, we're quite conditioned, aren't we, as a society, to equate distress with illness and disorder. I mean, I see that through social media, particularly TikTok and platforms like that. Young people self-diagnosing, and I can understand why people want to, because it helps you to make sense of your experiences, and it can feel extremely validating, and it can feel in a way a bit like justice. For me, it was a bit. I could say to people, well, I can't work. No, I don't work because I've got chronic episodic depression, and I have anxiety disorder, and I have bipolar type 2 disorder, and I have this, and I have that, and I have that, and I have that. It was far easier for me to say that because I couldn't say, actually, I want to kill myself because I'm a survivor of CSA and nobody knows about it, and my family don't know, and I don't know what to do about it. And I'm frightened, and I don't know how to live, and I have no purpose, and I feel like I've fallen off the path of life, and I've got no education. And how more am I supposed to do? And it was easier for me to just really hang on to this idea that there was something really wrong, or that I was ill. And these GPs are frustrated because partly they, as well, when you are really, really struggling, you do need support. Some people need really intensive support. Some people cannot work. They can't. When you're trying to struggle through that and you're trying to put one foot in front of the other, of course you can't work. And yet, to be able to receive benefits that allow you to live, you have to have a diagnosis, and you have to, it has to be this or. And never CSA, is it? It's never enough that we are just CSA survivors, and actually we need a bit of support whilst we find a way through. And it is absolutely possible to find a way through, but it doesn't feel like it when you're in it at all. And it's also really difficult for me to have these conversations, because when I do, I can be quite quickly accused of stigmatizing mental illness or pill shaming people. And that is never my intention, because again, I don't speak for all survivors. I'm speaking for, this is my own experience. And I know it's the experience of other people, but it's not the experience of all. And some survivors will find huge amounts of benefits from this route that I took that caused so much harm. But there are a lot of people that don't. And so therefore these stories must be heard, so that people can offer. It's all about choice, isn't it? It's what do we offer people? For some people, they may prefer a medicalised route, but I didn't know the alternative. I didn't even know it existed. I couldn't believe when I found my local charity that I'd walk past this charity every day for years and years, and I didn't even know it existed. Now, how was that even possible? Why the secrecy? Why the tiny little acronym on a tiny little plaque on a door that you wouldn't notice? Why are we so ashamed? Why are we perpetuating this shame? I don't understand it. I would love to one day just have a Flying Chiild headquarters with exactly what we're there for, because I'm not ashamed of it. I have zero shame anymore. It's gone away. It's absolutely gone away. But if I had seen somebody like me with zero shame, perhaps I would have had less shame. It took a long, long time for me to drop those feelings of shame. And I have managed to do so because of the support that I've been able to get, and because of the peer support that I've been in, and the amazing, incredible survivors that I meet every single day.
There's a lot of stuff there, Sophie, that I could come into on, I think, and amazing insights. And one of the things I'm really interested in your book, you talked about having a retreat centre for survivors, which I think is really something really interesting. We can go for long term. There is something in Australia very similar to that, I think. And, it would be good to have that in the UK. I think people have tried to do that in the UK for sexual violence, but it would be really good to see those kind of therapeutic spaces we can go for a week or 2 weeks and a month and kind of kind of really work together. But I want to bring you back to something else that's kind of emerging in there, which is activism. And over the weekend, I saw you engaging where somebody had kind of emailed you or something, or direct messaged you, and you hadn't answered them in 24 hours. So I want to ask you, how are you managing the boundaries and the complexities of being an activist? Actually putting yourself out there. It's difficult enough with the people in the system who will push back against you if you tell them things they don't want to hear, basically. But how do you work it with other survivors? Because that can be as complex, because not everybody's in the same place or comes from the same perspective.
No.
Some of which you've kind of articulated around the difference around kind of labelling within mental health structures, often, as you say, for links to benefit and support. How are you keeping yourself grounded and safe after that amazing energy it's taking for you to recover yourself? Because that's what recovery is, as Gabor Mate absolutely nails. How are you keeping yourself kind of focused, sane in that structure, in that kind of environment?
I have amazing support around me. I have incredible mentors as well. So other survivor activists, but also survivor allies. People who would just other CEOs of other organisations. I found particularly, being able to actually just pick up the phone and say to somebody, "This is the situation I'm faced with. Could I get a bit of advice?" And being able to just chat things over with other people. Having regular supervision is absolutely vital for me. I have supervision once a month, absolutely without fail. If something comes up in between my appointments, I would increase that. I think that is something I would always recommend. But of course, it's difficult because it all relies on funding as well. We were lucky to be able to get the National Lottery Community Funding, and we also received a donation which allowed us to be able to then put things like that in place. And I think that is absolutely vital. But also by not tolerating abuse. And the reason that I called that out on social media is because just because you're a survivor, it doesn't give you the right. I understand being triggered. Absolutely, it's overwhelming, and you can be so caught up in that moment and you can't see anybody else's point of view. And I absolutely understand it. So it wasn't actually intended as a critical post, more of an observation. But it also isn't okay. And we are just as capable of anyone else of after the event, particularly recognising it and saying, "I'm sorry." And so I think, I tend to call it out every now and again when something like that happens. On the whole, it doesn't, though, I have to say. On the whole, those types of situations are quite rare. I would say probably, only a handful of times over the last few years. And the amount of interactions that I have I'd say going to the hundreds. It's so many people. And so it was also quite useful for me because I was able to then reflect on, well, what messages am I putting out? Because I need to remind people that I'm not a counsellor. I'm not a qualified counsellor. I never want to give the impression that I am. I also don't want to give the impression that I have all the answers as a survivor. Sometimes that makes me feel quite uncomfortable. I have people saying things like, "Please tell me how to be like you." That makes me quite uncomfortable because, this is an ongoing process for me. This is perhaps a lifelong process for me. No, not perhaps. It is a lifelong process for me. And I am at peace with that. So I try to be very authentic, I suppose, in the way that I post, in the way that I write. So if I write a blog or if something comes up for me, I might write it. And part of that is to show that it is okay actually to have these days where you just think, "Oh God, I'm really struggling with this." Because that's realistic. And again, that comes from maybe what I needed. What I didn't need was that, I suppose I would call it like maybe a toxic positivity slant on surviving CSA. I found that quite hard when I was feeling suicidal, to have people saying, well, if you do that, you can be like me. And, I don't believe it either. I feel that there a lot of stuff that we see, that all that people share and put online is quite, kind of cherry picking the best bits. And so I do try and be a bit authentic, but mainly it's the network that I have around me. Being challenged by my supervisor, particularly around the hours that I'm working and things like that. That's where I kind of will fall down. I think is that I want to work and keep doing it, and so I just keep working. And then sometimes I realise I've done these ridiculous number of hours in a week. But I have got people, around and aware of that. I have an amazing freelancer who said to me it was a couple of months ago. She said I was supposed to be going on some leave, and she said, and I said to her the day before, I just can't. There's just far too much to do. And she said, if you don't, I'm actually going to resign because this isn't sustainable. And I didn't know if she was joking or not. I don't think she was. So I actually did go away, and it was the best thing that I could have done. I needed to just stop. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think you've answered lots. I mean, it's interesting just hearing your reflections, really. We are conscious of time because time flies. Behind the pun, no pun intended. And my final kind of Niamh may have a different question to ask or to suggest you. Have you any question to ask me and Niamh? Because this isn't an interview. This is a conversation. That's what we're hoping to create, is a conversation between peer activists, basically. Some of us may have a lot more kind of road miles than others, but all of us have a kind of perspective that should be heard, and that's the reason we really generated Kintsugi conversations about and focused on the activism, is because I think it's time we heard all the different perspectives. I don't think people in the system actually hear those. What they hear is co-production management. They have people sitting around the table and kind of wanting you to answer their list of questions on their kind of agenda. What they're not really hearing is the conversations we have amongst ourselves. And if they're ready to hear it, I'm not sure, but I think we should be having those conversations. So have you any questions you'd like to ask me and Niamh about our kind of views about this or anything?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One is how do you hang on to that hope? Because there must be times where you're hit with frustration, Robert, perhaps how slow the change is, or maybe you're not. Maybe you're always glass half full. I don't know. The other thing is, I suppose, is the could you say what is the biggest barrier in your perspective, from your point of view? What is the biggest barrier to change?
So the first question is, I had to define myself, and I think I'm always changing. So I don't think we're all changing. That's what recovery is. You kind of recover yourself, but you're always growing. So I like growth. I have the idea that you're changing as a human being. So I'm a humanist in many ways. I'm a cynical optimist. I kind of think, it's really difficult to have hope because you keep on being kind of one step forward, 3 steps back often. Well, that's my experience over 25 years. It might be very different for me in some ways because I'm also very outspoken. So I come from a kind of very working class Docklands kind of environment because that's where I was born. And, so I kind of grew up with people who were larger than life, said what they think, and were very direct about it. They weren't bad people. They were just very direct, the kind of people you see in unions. So they're very much kind of like that kind of. So those were the males that surrounded me, and the females around me, because I was born in Merseyside. So, women had as much matriarchal power. So we had matriarchs. I can think of matriarchs in my family now who were kind of really, in many ways, in charge of lots of things. And males had their roles. So I'm hopeful because I think human beings evolve. I think culture is not a fixed thing. I think it's a very kind of transient thing. It evolves and changes. I think the challenge is, that's why activism is not just sexual violence. Everything that's changed in our society over thousands of years has changed by groups of people stepping up and demanding change. And that can be a very, very slow and very challenging and dangerous process for some people in certain contexts. But if you don't do that, you get this dead end, and that never works because it always eats itself. Societies have to evolve or die. That's my view of it. So I'm hopeful in human beings. I know that sounds really strange as a survivor. I'm hopeful of human beings. What do I think stops it? In my experience of 25 years of being out here and being very in the face of power, it doesn't like people from my background being in its face. And not just me experiencing that. You can read all the books about class struggle and all the rest of it that goes on. Just look at Mike Lynch, who's the RMT guy, who's actually very articulate, very balanced in my view, talks about lots of things that are real, not myths. And the pushback he gets is quite amazing about who he is and stuff. I think it's fear. I think the system is frightened. I think professionals are frightened of changing because power changes. If you change the story from illness to trauma and you can't fix it, as you rightly said at the beginning, Sophie, you can't be fixed. I can't fix you. I can come alongside you and be an ally. I can be a guide. I can be a mentor. I can do all these things, but I can't fix it. You have to fix it because you're the only one who has the power to change the way you engage with what was done to you, because it didn't happen to you. It isn't a biological kind of deterministic kind of experience. It is something that somebody very, reading your book, very sadistic, extremely disturbed psychopath did to you as a child. And that's awful. And no one can change it, but you can change the future. And you've done that in many ways, with your children and with your life and what you're doing now. Fear. Fear is, what Yoda said, fear is the road to the dark side, basically. And people are terrified. They're terrified of sexual abuse. They're terrified of dealing with it, and they just want it to go away. That's why they limit the strategies they have are kind of, more deployed than they've ever been in social strategy. Rape crisis pushed for that and others push for it. But in the end, it's fear, I think. They're frightened of change. And they won't be good enough. And their power will disappear. And actually, I tell them, your power will be enhanced. You won't have the same power because it'll be a different experience for you as a professional. But you'll have power to actually do what you've always dreamed one would hope you would do, which is to help people to recover themselves, as Gabor Mate says. Recover yourself, because that's what recovery is. Yeah, so I think it's fear. And the hope is us. That's the truth. The hope is us. The hope is human beings. And the lady who cried at your presentation is evidence of that. Cried at not the abuse, but cried at our resistance to change.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting answer. I love cynical optimist. I think that as well. You made me think about our work within the NHS, and one of the things that I think I'm most proud of is the development of a pathway of care for survivors of sexual violence in perioperative care, a small hospital, a small clinic, and one of the things that we really felt we were doing is almost allowing people to give themselves permission to practice in the way that they always dreamed that they would practice. When you're a child or a young person, you think, I want to grow up and I want to help people, and then something shifts, and suddenly you feel that maybe you're not able to do that because of all the restrictions in place, and being able to put something else back in place that allows people to give themselves permission to work in the way that they imagine working, with empathy, with intuitively, with care and compassion at its absolute heart. It's an amazing thing to witness. Niamh, I'm really curious to know if your perspectives are similar to Rob's, or if they are really different, just as that ally perspective. And also, do you see, when you tell people what you're doing, when you go and tell people about this podcast, do you see that reaction that I see when I I see it all the time. I describe it as a kind of shuttering of expression.
Yeah.
People wish that you'd said anything but that. And I'm wondering if you see that as well, or if that's something that's directed very much at the survivor.
No, that's definitely something I see. I think pretty much everyone I've told what job I do and like the about the podcast is just that immediate, it's almost like a panic as well of like, oh god, I really wasn't expecting her to say that. And the response is also always, that's so heavy, that is so heavy. And I'm like, I mean, I guess the content can be, but I don't feel that way about it at all. It's so much more than heavy. It's empowering, it's joyful, it's hopeful. And I think people do kind of zone in on the negative part of it because they're kind of unaware. And that's like kind of my answer to the barriers as well, is like an indifference and an unwillingness for people to learn about these things because they feel uncomfortable or because it's easier to ignore it for them. Which I've noticed, and that like kind of shuttering and the panic is the perfect example of that. But I would say that the kind of hope in it for me is similar to Rob, really. It's in the people, the activists that you meet, and not even the activists. I mean, we know lots of professionals that are working really hard to make this change. But every person I come across within this movement is they have that their own element, their own kind of hope, and their own desires for change and their own drives. Which and I think it's that community that you get when you meet someone that is striving for the same things, and you go, actually, it feels like, I think a lot of the time you're alone on this journey and you're the only person that actually feels that there needs to be this change, and you come across so many people that aren't aware of it or just are indifferent to it. And then when you meet the people that do feel the same way and are working towards the same change, it is hopeful and it's joyful.
Yeah, it can be very joyful, and I think people find that hard to understand sometimes. For me personally, my absolute favourite way of working. Recently, we had a couple of panels. One was at the Festival of Activism against CSA. The Flying Chiild were a festival partner this year, and the panel that we had was we had John Slater, who's a co-founder of Momentum Devon, was the male survivor voice there, and I was there in that survivor role, but also as somebody who's working with practitioners. And we had an amazing survivor, Fatima, whose background's very different to mine, and we had social worker, consultant social worker from Barnardo's, and a wonderful head teacher, both of them passionate about making change. And there's a real power that happens when you come together like that, from different places, different perspectives, different sectors, and it's my absolute most favourite way of working. And at the book launch as well, we had I chose to have a GP on the panel for the reasons that we discussed tonight, because being able to bring in that perspective of somebody who is actually really, really on board. He is that ally. He wants to make changes, but he also is caught to some extent and frustrated with the system, and has a real drive to make a difference. I think it's the best way of working, and I'm really curious that you received those reactions as well, Niamh, from people. I was going to say, in a way, it makes me feel better, but that feels really bad. I don't want to receive those reactions. But I'm really curious. It's almost like you can become a bit of a pariah for standing up for what is right. Nobody can dispute that it's the right thing. What we're doing is the right thing. The work that I'm doing is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. And yet the responses that I get are shocking sometimes, absolutely shocking. And I've lost people along the way, and which was devastating at first. I mean, it nearly stopped me. It nearly stopped me, and I thought, is it worth it? And now I'm actually okay with that. My circle's a lot smaller, but it becomes that driving force, because the day that we stop seeing those reactions is the day that we've made a difference.
Mm.
And maybe that's the day when I'll retire. But I've got a long way. I don't think that will happen in my lifetime. But I don't know about you, Rob, but I feel that there has been a bit of a shift, and I feel that things are changing a little bit since I started, and I've been doing this for hardly any time at all compared to you. And I don't know if you think this as well, or whether that is just a bit of, maybe it is a bit of optimism, but I feel there's been a little bit of a shift in certain attitudes, in engagement on social media, that type of thing.
So what I can say is that from 25 years ago to now is a revolution. So 25 years ago, it was a couple of analog tape players at the end of telephone lines, and rape crisis, maybe 3 or 4 centres existed. Males were kind of stuck in a small room in London somewhere, and someone popped in once a week. NAPAC was basically a drop box at the NSPCC headquarters in Shoreditch, and someone would pop in every couple of weeks to pick up the posts, and there you get a letter back from a therapist after 3 months. So it was a completely different world. But there were people who were activists then. So the Survivors Trust, for instance, is about to celebrate its whatever they're celebrating. And, you know, I was kind of there at the first meeting where we all had hummus. I never had hummus. It was an experience for me to have hummus. I've never had hummus ever since. And, you know, that was in Clapham in London, and it kind of created the Survivors Trust. Rape crisis of now 50-odd centres wherever it is. And there's a national 24-hour helpline, you know, so, and more money than ever there has been in relation to supporting services delivered directly to survivors. So it would be crass to say that it hasn't shifted. The UK, in many ways, is ahead of the game for the most of the world. If you talk to people in the Brave movement, they'll tell you that across Europe. And, you know, America is a very kind of privatized world. So you've got insurance, you can get therapy. There's no services, particularly like we have, though they do exist, and do stuff. So yeah, we're in a very different place. So it would be, you know, it would be crass to say that wasn't the case. The great leap now, and I thought it would be over by now. There are people who kind of, you probably met, will tell you that I kind of said, oh, it'll be 25 years, it'll be sorted. I thought that was a long time. And now it's another 25 years, I think. So you finally get to the place where the NHS has shifted, where social workers get whole modules in training about child sexual abuse, because currently that doesn't happen as far as I'm aware. You know, where psychiatrists, wherever psychiatry morphs into, are actually trained to deal with trauma rather than these fantastical ideas about, you know, it all being in your genes, because there's no such thing as kind of genetic predisposition towards being trauma affected. It's called being human and adapting. So all of those things, you know, so we have a long way to go. So I'm an activist, and Niamh will laugh because she kind of said, I've said, oh, I'll retire soon. And both Niamh and somebody else in the office just burst out laughing. He said, you'll never stop, because you'll just go on until you drop. And they said it with a smile and kindness, because I think if you've got that kind of DNA, because I think it is a kind of DNA, to contradict myself, but it's kind of really, it's in your soul, in your spirit, to be challenging what's unjust. And the way survivors are treated in our society, even with all of that rapid change, is still hearing stories from survivors who come to us about their experiences in systems. And some of them are horrific. And I'm thinking, you know, where are these people who call themselves professionals coming from, to be frank? And the resistance to anything that challenges status quos is so entrenched in our society. You see it in the post office scandal, you know, the inquiry into childhood sexual abuse. And they, you know, that was kind of run for 8 years, and I know a lot about that and how that started. You know, £180 million, and it sits on a shelf. So, you know, political decision making, all of these things. But the hope is that change has happened. It's hard won. You know, we have lots of conflicts around lots of things around funding with the battles for funding in agencies, because it is a funding landscape of conflict often. But, the reality is we're all going to the same place. That place is liberation. Whether you're a feminist or humanist like me, it's about liberation from all of these oppressive things that me and you, particularly, Sophie, have experienced in childhood. And Niamh has to experience every day she walks down the road as a young woman often, from the harassment that exists out there on the streets. So all of those things need to be stopped. And I think they're stoppable. So I could go on and you get me on that kind of stuff. Someone said I should be an MP or I should have been a preacher. I'm not quite sure which one I would have worked better. So it's kind of doing this stuff. But I passionately still believe, and that's what keeps me going, because someone gave me a hard time once, and there was somebody who knows me very well turned around and said, you should be very careful, because he could have jumped ages ago, because there's no reason why he needed to stay, because he could have gone off and done other things, and actually has the skills and the experience and knowledge to do that, and actually earns a lot of money doing that. But he stayed because he believes the change is worth the investment. That you need to have real. Someone once told me when I first started that, I said, I should get out of this because it's crazy. These people don't want to hear you. And that's survivors and systems, because I have particularly strong views about things. Many of them have been, more often wrong, but many of them have actually turned out to be correct over the years. And, I said, get out. He said, well, no, you need to stay because you need to have real. And I think that's what activism is about. And what this story is about is not kind of giving in to the kind of suppression of the reality of this experience and keep pushing for change, because that's the only way it happens.
Yeah.
I'm going to be quiet now because I could go on forever.
Yeah, it's been a really great hour and 20 minutes of conversation. So we have run a little bit over, but I think everything we've said has been so important. It's been really great, and it's just been really nice to have you on, Sophie, and hear your perspectives and hear about the Flying Chiild. And I wish we could talk for hours, to be honest.
I know. I'd like to carry on.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could call you. We're going to other people, so we've got a lot of people. But I'd like to bring you back, Sophie, because I think the conversation has been really, really good. And maybe we could bring you back and have a conversation more about other stuff, because now you can see how it all works and stuff. Would you be willing to do that and talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I could have what I really wanted to talk to you, we'll maybe do this next time, was about this idea of purpose.
Okay.
Because I think that can be quite an inspiring one for people to hear. I won't go into it now, but it was a big part of the book, as you will see, is being able to find that purpose for somebody that has experienced perhaps the type of soul crushing things that we have. For me, that was very important. I'd love to be able to kind of inspire other people, perhaps not to give up, because I know how soul destroying it can be when you're in that place.
You have to have a belief in yourself, and you have to kind of look after yourself. I mean, the lesson I've learned after 25 years is maybe I didn't look after myself at the best at times, and I forgot people. I forgot the people around me, and because I got so focused on the mission of changing the world that I forgot there were people around me who loved me and cared for me and were supportive, but I didn't give them any time, really. I gave all the time to the mission, and that's not just me. That's kind of spread across the history of activism. You read the literature and the books about it. So, it's remembering them as well and finding the balance, and that's really hard.
That balance is hard,
but it's something that you need to learn to do to sustain yourself, or you lose them. And that's regretful. You kind of, it's hard when you lose people that you didn't want to lose. It's just the obsession is too strong a word, I think, though someone might argue it might be. It's that focus on change that drives it. And also building, I'm pretty happy to know that when I don't think I'll ever stop in one way or the other, being kind of involved and speaking about it. I'm not sure I'll be as focused. In fact, in many ways, I'm not as kind of connected to all that kind of stuff anymore, because there's a whole new generations like you appearing. And I think they should be supported, really, so that you can take it on to the next part of the story. And we can.
I love that you call me new generation, because I feel so old.
Well, I suspect you're not as old as me. So, and you know that is really, really important to understand. Is that you're taking and you're bringing the next chapters in the story of change, and we're more the kind of old, the old kind of chiefs and whatever we would like to be termed as, kind of sitting around in the teepee in my mind, and you can come and smoke the pipe and kind of ask us questions, and we still do our stuff, but you're the ones who have to go out there and face the systems, and you're doing amazing with that, with the work you're doing with the Flying Chiild, going into schools and really, and I think that time is now here. I think people are ready for it. So I'm conscious of time, and we're kind of coming to the end, I think. Good. So I'll hand over to Niamh to close down the session.
Cool. Well, if anyone's listening, and I hope they are, you heard it here first, that hopefully Sophie will be back to join us again. And thank you for listening to Kintsugi Conversations.
Thank you very much.